encourage you in terms of preparing for this course and others, if you can prepare with your peers, and even when it comes to writing your essay, one thing that's really helpful with the essay writing, you should be well into that now, is to read it out. It always looks good when you write it down on the page, but then you start reading it to someone else and say, oh, that's a little awkward here or there, or they can ask you questions for clarification or fill in gaps. Strongly recommended to get together with your peers and vet your essays that way. All right, in terms of where we are though now, we are on the topic of empire. We are 1 week behind in the readings. I'm not at all put out by that, but what I would encourage you to do is keep reading ahead so that things do trail off a little bit. I think there are just YouTube videos on the last, interviews on the last day there, but get ahead in the readings. This is the substance of the course. This is the expectation in terms of what we're learning here together are these primary sources, so get to know those. Our topic at hand is empire. And so we can there we go. Kind of lost it. We can begin with the political theory question of what is an empire, or what is imperialism, referring to the ideology that informs empire. And I'll just say at the outset, this is a political phenomenon that is difficult to define precisely because it is so dynamic. Empires tend to expand and contract spatially, and they're historically dynamic. They tend to rise and fall. Yeah.
And there's also a difference in what empires look like or operate on.
Yeah.
I wouldn't exactly call the Portugal trading empire the same thing as the British imperial. Yeah.
Well, and this is the question. Lenin would agree with you, Andrew, in saying that, Lenin being the historicist, or the historical materialist, and then as a historical materialist, by that I mean that every historical moment is unique, and our political categories are traceable to an underlying material reality. In Marxist language, our intellectual superstructure is linked to an underlying substructure, which is primarily economic in terms of its foundations. And so, for Lenin, there's no comparison between, for example, a largely agrarian, trade-based empire like Athens and a capitalist empire like the United States. Different historical moments, different underlying economic realities, and so different political formations.
What was Athens?
Athens was primarily agricultural, although it was agriculturally poor itself, so it depended upon the import of agricultural goods from other cities, with those trade routes protected obviously by its preeminent navy. Yeah.
And there's also differences in means that this empire, like it extracted political and monetary concessions from those that were under it, which is different from them saying like the British or other like empires like the Roman Empire, which took direct political control over.
And that was a real question too when it came to American intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was a moment there from 2001 to 2009 where there was a whole host of characters from across the political spectrum talking about American imperialism in positive and laudatory terms, encouraging the United States to become more of an empire. We have Neil Ferguson. Has anyone encountered this thinker in history, perhaps? British historian Neil Ferguson. On the reading list there, kind of a later piece from Vanity Fair on America's imperial decline. But he was a strong advocate for the Americans basically to follow the example of the British and suck it up and assume that imperial mantle, to go about the difficult work of holding on to its empire to make the world safe for liberal democracy and free market capitalism.
Sorry, that just sounds very, when you say suck it up and assume the mantle of empire, it sounds very much like the white man.
Absolutely. No, he approvingly.
I'm thinking like
he approvingly quotes.
Bourbons have an empire. It's a burden politically and financially, but
Yeah.
it's not a.
Well, I mean, honestly, it probably was more of a burden than it helped the British economy.
Well, that's the point that Hobson makes from our readings today. But yeah, Ferguson approvingly quotes Rudyard Kipling here, the author of this idea of the white man's burden, and says that the British held the world together, and the Americans need to do the same now. And to the extent that they are isolationist in their foreign policy, the world will tend to fall to pieces.
Rudolph who?
Kipling. Yeah, Ferguson absolutely unapologetic about that. But fast forward to the present, is there something inherently different about the American intervention in Afghanistan or in Iraq, where direct political control of outlying territories did not seem to be a priority of the Bush administration? When we looked at Secretary of State Colin Powell last week, the concern was how do we get in and get out and not have to administer social programs for foreign population in a far-off country, the culture and language of which we don't understand. So this is why our own Michael Ignatieff advocated for some kind of empire light, that would stop short of the political administration of far-off territories, but definitely encourage foreign intervention and the replacement of hostile governments with ones friendly to Western interests. So, but this is, at this point, this is just a question: how do we define empire, considering how different these various formations are?
I would argue it's merely a political system which attempts to stitch multiple different ethnic or cultural groups together for some common cause, both positive and negative. So then you would have ones that band together on their own decisions, like Austria-Hungary, or ones that band together by power, like Napoleon over the United States, or something like that.
Well, you mentioned an important point here, and that is that one of the characteristic features of empires is that they're large units with diverse populations. So we can't point to a homogeneous national population. So, it's easy to define what is a nation state. What is a nation state? I think we began the course of this, yeah?
States formed to serve the interests of a specific nation or people.
Sure. So, and we have the two component parts. We have the state part, which is, how do we define a state? Recall? I've leaned heavily on Max Weber here through the course. Yeah.
Sorry, a bunch of people just swapped in.
Yep, jump in.
Sure. I would really a political unit that has some monopoly of certain force.
Yeah.
Use of violence.
Use of violence.
That whole sovereignty,
Yeah.
which is the monopoly of the force.
But-
Within the violence.
Within the violent force.
Key differences involved. Powers involved with very different violations.
So the quote is, this is from Politics as a Vocation, a monopoly on the use of legitimate organized violence within a given territory. The given territory part is important. If you were to say, where's a state, you can point to it on the map. Say, there's Canada. Now there may be some kind of gray areas. Denmark and Canada contest over Hans Island in the Arctic. Canada and the U.S. contest over part of the Beaufort Sea, again, in the far north. But for the most part, we know where Canada is. Yeah, you can point to it on the map. It's a relatively stable territorial unit that's capable of defending its borders and policing its population. And then in terms of the nation-state part of it, in terms of a nation, we have a arguably relatively homogeneous population based upon language, history, sometimes religion, culture. Arguably, that's kind of out of date, given, for example, the multicultural aspect of Canadian national identity. But it has been a historical fixture, at least within political science and international relations, to identify states in terms of the nations that comprise them. And there can be multiple nations too. There are 3 founding nations in Canada, for example. So there's that. We don't begin in that same sort of way when we're talking about an empire. They're characteristically diverse in terms of the populations that they govern, and they're characteristically dynamic in terms of this tendency to expand to a point and then contract and collapse. They're unstable political units in that sense. Hobson describes empires as, quote, elusive, shifting, changeful. Nation states rise and fall too. Canada has not always been and will not always be. Yeah.
The Roman Empire, the Grecian Empire section, lasted for 300 years.
Mm.
The Byzantines had almost 1,000-year reign.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
HRE lasted 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Stable over. There are some that endure longer or shorter periods of time. The Athenian Empire had a rather short run. If we're dealing with modern states, they're all relatively short in the tooth compared to some of the examples that you give. The question here, though, is how do we define them? Right? If we can't pin them down on a map, especially, how do we define what an empire is? Lenin suggests that any definition of imperialism must be historically specific, although he would say the same thing about any political category whatsoever. I would suggest, though, that if we can't define an empire as such in an ahistorical way, in a way that transcends time, there are certain perennial tensions that exist within empires. And this is sort of my general approach to what we call regimes theory.
Sorry, you said that if it doesn't transcend time, then there's a what?
So if we had an ahistorical definition of empire, say empire is blank, this, yeah. And this definition applies to the Athenian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, the American Empire. What do they all have in common? And if that were the case, if we could do such a thing, then there would be an ahistorical definition of empire, a definition that is ahistorical in the sense of transcending time. It was true then, it's true now, it will be true in the future. So we don't have that kind of easy beginning here. We don't begin with something like Weber's definition of the state. And acknowledging, too, as has been said, that states rise and fall as empires do. But there's something characteristically dynamic and driven towards expansion in terms of empires. And so for that reason, I describe these perennial tensions within empires as their defining qualities. If not a definition as such, there are certain contradictions that exist within empires that move them to expand. Mentioned regimes theory. This is an approach that myself and my colleagues, Professor Tabachnik and Professor Teixeira, have taken up. We've got a few books, a few collections in this series that what we call the regime series now. I think it started with tyranny, and moved on to oligarchy, and then empire, and then theocracy. And what we've been trying to do is to take the classical classification of regimes from Aristotle and Plato and apply that to contemporary international relations, with the thinking being that there's a very different political psychology, different set of motives that informs different regimes. Not all regimes behave in the same way. So contra thinkers like Morgenthau, for example, a classical realist, who defines what motivates states according to Morgenthau.
Balance of power?
Balance of power, yeah. And what do states want?
Security and peace.
The struggle for power and peace, yeah, the subtitle of his book. But in terms of what motivates states, national interests are defined in terms of power. Yeah? This is what all states want. All states basically want the same thing. What we're saying in this regimes theory is that that's not altogether true. Different states seem to be motivated by characteristically different interests. If you're dealing with an oligarchy ruled by the rich, what do the rich want? They want to maintain and increase their wealth and position of privilege within society. That's what's maintained.
So it's more lean toward interest, not power.
those interests could vary. Those interests could vary. The int-
I feel like the back again is more important than the middle.
what do you mean by that?
Because then regime theory will then, which says everything is different, they're probably decided by the rationality of those in charge, meaning that it's a rational thought that will push international relations, not any kind of want for power. So like a trading kingdom,
Yeah.
that's only interested in making money in trading, doesn't want large territorial land masses, they only want few islands like we can see.
Yeah, a mercantilist nation would be different from a capitalist nation, perhaps, yeah, in terms of their underlying economies. The point I think we're making here is a really simple one, is that the interests of different regimes differ. You know? Not all states behave in the same sort of ways. You would expect a tyranny to behave differently than an oligarchy, and differently than a democracy, differently than a theocracy or an empire, for that matter. So if you're interested in this in terms of the course, the book is Enduring Empire. It's not on reserve at the library, but it's at the library. I didn't assign it for this course because I don't want to profit off
Sorry,
it.
what's it called?
Enduring Empire. Enduring Empire.
And you guys wrote it?
Yep. Yep. So we've got those 4 now in this series.
Why
Good.
don't you promote your book?
Well,
It sounds really good.
Yeah, I think it's a good book. Yeah, well, I'm doing it right now, but I'm not telling you to go buy it.
Is it the Yates Publishing Company, but with 2 cents units per book or something?
Well, no, I like my publisher actually. U of T Press has been good to us guys. Yeah. But anyways, it's at the library, so you can go read it for free. Yeah, the point is to get the ideas around. So this approach suggests that there are certain perennial tensions at play, certain questions that keep cropping up generation after generation. Even if the answers differ from time to time, the questions remain the same. That's the basic underlying idea of this volume. And these certain regimes keep cropping up again and again in different circumstances, different forms, on different scales perhaps, but with some resonance over time. What are the tensions that exist within empires then? If we can't define an empire, what are these perennial tensions? One obvious one, and we can see this in our readings from Thucydides, and we'll see this especially when we turn to the Sicilian debate today, is that the drive to expand for the purpose of security as a kind of preemptive defense against potential future threats. Recall the Milian position, we just allow us to maintain our neutrality. You say, no, if we let you go on living independently, that will be a demonstration of our weakness, which will encourage other subject states to rebel. So we have to conquer you, we have to make this show of strength in order to maintain what we already have. We need to continually expand in order to maintain ourselves as an empire. This will lead to the collapse of the Athenian Empire in this disastrous Sicilian expedition. The Milians were right in many senses when they say that you're making enemies that you don't need to make here, and you'll cause others to raise their own preemptive defenses against you in turn. There's a security dilemma, as was mentioned earlier. The drive to expand for the purpose of security eventually compromises that security. This is one tension that exists within empires. On an economic, according to an economic assessment, the drive to expand for economic interests, like what we see in Lenin and Hobson, tends to undercut its promised economic gains to the point of what's referred to as imperial overstretch. Imperial overstretch. That is, at a point, maintaining the empire costs more than the empire brings in from hinterland to metropole. Yep.
I remember thinking a critical theory in why the Roman Empire fell.
Oh, okay.
In the sense that their empire was so expansive and it wasn't after like a certain century crisis and plague and devastation and massive wars, it just wasn't bringing the money necessary to support its mass expansion.
Actually, in terms of the percentage there, this phrase, imperial overstretch, is associated with the historian Paul Kennedy, and he gives a figure of 10% of what we refer to as gross domestic product. 10% of gross domestic product spent on military expenditures for the maintenance of the empire. He presents this as a kind of average kind of tipping point at which it costs more than it brings in. So there's this tension. If the point is to gain access to new markets, if the point is to raise new tributes, again, this is why Athens expanded, because it was relatively poor itself, short of what it can funnel in to that imperial heartland. At a point that logic finds its limits. And then finally, in terms of ideology, the universalization of civilizational aims by force of arms compromises the value of those noble purposes and conflates the expansion of an empire and the extension of its own national interest with some universal good. And this last tension is especially prominent in democratic or republican empires, like Athens or like the United States. How can we forcibly export democracy through the force of arms? There seems to be an underlying tension there. Rousseau says in the Social Contract that men can be forced to be free. And I think that quote kind of captures this paradox that's at play, especially again in democratic or republican empires. There seems to be something inconsistent between principles of democracy on the one hand and the means of empires on the other. And it raises the question, and this is a real one for us, are democracies capable of imperialism? Recall the debate over the fate of the Mutalineans. And I should say, we left on a rather dour note last week in terms of this preemptive defense. Do you recall? Preemptive defense against the revolt that was brewing in Lesbos, led by Mutaline, and with Cleon advocating for the genocide of the Mytilenean people, and with Diodotus arguing that they should be spared. This was too much. Maybe deal with the rabble rousers, but let the people live. This story actually ends up not as nasty as that debate would seem to tend towards. So what happened was, initially, Cleon won the day, and the Athenian people en masse, like everyone, engaged in this democratic debate. The demos gathered, all of the citizens of Athens, all the adult, male, land-owning citizens of Athens, native-born citizens of Athens gathered, and decided this is what we should do. Cleon says, kind of goads them into saying, you're not really tough enough to maintain your empire. You're flip-flopping all over the place. Just settle on this, do what needs to be done to maintain your empire. Your empire is a tyranny, get over it, he says to them. And so they abide by what Cleon says, and they send off a trireme, a rowboat, fast rowboat, to carry out this awful mission. And a day and a half later, the Athenians meet again as a whole. And you had that second thought, maybe that was a little too much, and maybe that was a little excessive. And so they changed their minds. The Athenians changed their minds and say, no, spare the Mytilenean people. We'll execute the 1,000 men that led this uprising and let the rest live. And so they send another boat with this second fate. The first boat apparently wasn't rowing too fast. It was such a terrible mission to execute that no one wants to exterminate an entire city. So they were kind of lollygagging along the way. And then the second boat was really quite fired up by their mission, and aided also by Mytilenean envoys who gave them apparently nice wine to drink and barley to eat. So they were well stocked there for their trip. And they caught the other boat just as it was about to deliver the command to execute the whole population. and they were spared. So that story actually ended up on a more pleasant note than we ended up last week. I just thought I'd fill you in on the details there. I'm sure you've done the reading, but that's how the Middle Indians were spared. But back to this question, it raises this question that Cleon introduces: are democracies capable of imperialism? Yeah. Why?
Because in every historical example, the needs for democracy do not always equal to the needs of empire, as democracies care for their own interests more than the cause of empire. In every example, we see a democratic nation taking mantle of empire. If there are nationless democracies heavily flawed, ruled by almost tyrannical, like Cleon, or the imperial system is ruled by a council above the democracy, the multi-unit state, the homeless, and the English.
So it works if you have these elite interests sort of pulling the levers of empire, yeah? But it wouldn't be, truly speaking, a democracy. It would be a tyranny or some sort of oligarchy in that instance. Yeah?
Yeah, I would also agree with that sentiment in a different perspective, in the sense that, like, when we see that story, is that you get that sober second thought, and you're like, oh, that was a terrible idea, wasn't it? Is that you're in democracies in which a larger amount of people get say, or is a large amount of people decision matter, or public opinion matters, is that you are going to have people who are dissenters to those ideas. There's this one variety of ideologies, and not everyone's going to go with the idea. So even in the United States, we see a lot of people that agree with the imperialism and who are explicitly against it. So it's never, to have an empire, you need that sort of, I would argue, that sort of Freon vision of, like, we just got to do this, and that's easier to fix for those people with powerful, disabled, that.
Interesting. Yeah?
Yeah, they can actually.
What's that?
If the population embraces a certain Weber or Carl Schmitty view of the other, seeing them as a threat or things to use from, then a policy usually for them to use from the rule from over and
We saw that, in terms of American intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was a kind of latent racism at play there. The idea that somehow these people only understand force, that they're not quite ready for democracy yet. So the only way they can get there is through this forceful intervention. Racism helps. Jingoism helps. The idea that we're so strong, you're so weak. This sort of inflated sense of national pride. But back to this question of, again, is democracy capable of empire? And mention was made of dissent, the possibility for dissent, which is a core feature of a functioning democracy. We're talking not just about public forum for the expression of debate and discussion. A new cabinet was described today. I didn't catch that news yet. Has anyone seen? Okay. Yeah. This morning, and I was just preparing for class, so I haven't seen it yet. Trudeau's new cabinet, yeah. So, like, if you were to say, well, where's democracy? There's democracy there, the House of Parliament, this sort of thing. But civil society extends well beyond that to anywhere where we can express our dissent. This is key. In terms of the Sicilian debate, it was really interesting. The enthusiasm that was generated by Alcibiades' grand project for the Athenians. If you recall the debate and discussion between Nicias, the elder statesman and general, and Alcibiades, the fired up, rich, extravagant youth, when it seems clear that the majority are going to side with Alcibiades and vote for war with Syracuse in Sicily, breaking the peace and choosing war again, choosing to expand Athens' empire, Nicias does something that doesn't accomplish the end that he intended. He argues that, well, if we're going to do this, we better do this right. If we're going to invade Sicily, this far-off island, we need to send more ships. We need to provision them fully. we need cavalry with them. And his thought was at that point that this would dissuade the Athenians. You know, they would basically be defenseless at home. They would be overextended. They would throw everything they had at the Sicilian expedition. And Nicias, being the sort of voice of sober second thought, or the sort of prudent party to this debate, figures that people will just not go for it, considering that the stakes have been raised. The Athenians were that much more excited about the prospect, as if it were of even greater significance than it would have been otherwise. All alike, this is at book 6, paragraph 24, midway through. All alike were smitten with a passionate desire to sail. The older men looked forward to conquest at their destination, or at least no reversal for such a large armament. They thought they would be safe with those numbers. The young men of military age longed for foreign travel and the sights abroad, quite confident of a safe return. And the general mass of troops saw immediate pay in the prospect of further resources to fund a lifetime of public benefits. So those in armed service will do well by this, and they'll come back safely home, is what they thought. And then in terms of the capacity for dissent, this huge enthusiasm of the majority meant that anyone who did in fact disagree kept quiet, fearing that a contrary vote would brand him unpatriotic. So there were dissenting voices, they just didn't raise their voices. Right?
That is when it was brought up that the idea of a certain ideology or belief taking over the public is that there is that human instinct to go along with what the majority decides, or if they don't go along, keep quiet out of fear of being targeted.
We saw that in the American mainstream media. You know, given the massive protests against the invasion of Iraq, the largest worldwide protest that the world had ever seen, key architects of that policy, Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, came out in public saying that this expression of dissent, this protest, weakened American resolve and emboldened America's enemies. So basically, if you're dissenting against this illegal and unjust war, you're unpatriotic. And the people should instead rally around the flag. And early on in the conflict, the mainstream media in the United States did just that. They towed the line to the point at which it became increasingly clear that America was not winning that war, that the Iraqis were not inviting the Americans in with open arms. And we see, of course, the disastrous consequences of that now both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. It would have been timely, I think, to listen to that dissent at the moment. So this is the tension that I'd like to explore in contemporary terms especially, but reflecting back on this ancient example also. How do we square imperialism and democracy, given these tensions that seem to exist between means and ends? Especially, the ends were very similar in many ways between the Athenian Empire and the American Empire. Both had the intent of spreading the institutions of democracy, in one instance through the Hellenic world, and in the other through the world over. This is, we will get into these tensions more, but here's a neat little definition from George Grant, Lament for a Nation. I think many of you have read this text in intro. Yeah? Grant basically makes the argument that it's impossible for Canada to have an independent foreign policy, that we depend upon the United States for our defense, and the failure of the Diefenbaker government in his time to refuse the American demand that nuclear weapons be staged on Canadian soil was a demonstration of that failure of Canadians to chart an independent foreign policy. Not incidentally, those weapons were staged right here in North Bay, the Bulmark missiles. I just had a chance on that point to read a really interesting book and review it for Shirk. Has anyone signed up for like Book of the Month Club or anything like that, where someone sends you a book every month? It seemed like a good idea at the time. So Shirk is the the federal funding body for social sciences and humanities, and the Research Council. And they said, you want to review some books? And I said, sure. 13 a year, so they just keep on coming, these books do. But they are fascinating, and writing anonymous reviews is really liberating, actually. To be able to write a review of a book and not have to attach your name to it, as it goes back, I find this very liberating. I'm a little bit sharper. Yeah, they don't know at all. They don't know who I am. It's just like into the void here. Here's some words. Anyways, read I think a pretty decent book on NORAD. Are people familiar with this acronym? North American Air Defense. So the defense of Canada's and the United States airspace is shared with a binational, bilateral command structure shared between Canada and the United States. There is no Canadian air defense and American air defense. Our defenses are overlap and they're shared in that sense. And the authors of this book make what's referred to as a functionalist argument. Functionalism within IR, it was kind of a popular theory in the interwar period between the First World War and the Second World War. It states that questions about sovereignty, national interest will increasingly become less and less important. What we need to deal with are just the functions of states, the deliverables of states. And perhaps technocrats would be more adept at that than politicians. Politicians have their ideals, they have their own interests, and their national affiliations obviously then too, responsible to a population. Technocrats though are just looking for that one best way, the most efficient way. And the authors of this particular book argue that Canada and the United States should more deeply align their defenses. Following September 11th, there was a deepening of NORAD to extend to maritime surveillance. And in 2006, the NORAD agreement was extended in perpetuity. So there's an ongoing commitment of the United States and Canada to defend our airspace together. Yeah. But the authors argue that this is just kind of inevitable. It's the right thing to do, and let's do this. Let's deepen this commitment and set politics aside. Set all this political finagling aside. They advocate for an extension of NORAD to include cyber warfare, for example. This is a very real threat confronting both Canada and the United States, where borders don't seem to matter that much, as in the case of our airspace. And I think it's it's a good book, a disingenuous argument, because there are real political questions at play here. So, for example, there's been a long-standing, this will come up again, it's not presently in the news, but mark my words, this will come up again. Canada has at various intervals been encouraged to participate in a national missile defense system, national missile defense. The idea was first introduced by then President Ronald Reagan in the 80s as a strategic defense initiative, aka Star Wars. I call it the same dumb idea. It doesn't make a lot of sense in my mind. And the Paul Martin government in 2004, Paul Martin initially ran actually saying that he would endorse a national missile defense system, partly in order to maintain our position within NORAD in cooperation with the Americans in terms of the defense of our airspace, but then changed his mind, interestingly. It's one of those few rare and beautiful instances where civil society dissent had an influence on foreign policy. People tend not to be that interested in foreign policy. People are interested in taxation, social services, healthcare, education, things like that. People tend to be less enthused in terms of getting out in the streets when it comes to Canada's foreign policy. That's something that happens out there. Yeah? Missile defenses, how much does that bear on our day-to-day lives? Yeah? But Canadians came out in droves to protest in Canadian cities. There were defectors from the American program. The scientists who were working on the program basically said that in their presentations here in Canadian cities as well and at universities, basically saying that national missile defense just can't work, at least using conventional munitions, because it's hard to shoot a bullet with a bullet, if you can imagine. You don't know where the bullet's coming from. You don't know when someone's going to shoot it at you. You don't know what its trajectory is going to be. So to find that incoming projectile and hit it head on is really, really difficult. It's possible if you were to use nuclear weapons, though. Or it might be possible if you have space-based weapon platforms. The Iron Dome system, so that's an anti-ballistic missile system operating on a much smaller theater. Yeah, the Iron Dome works. The American Patriot missile system, which was originally used in that as part of that defense system, works. But the privileged position there is you're defending against the Gaza Strip, incoming missiles from the Gaza Strip, and you're defending a relatively small territory against a known adversary. We know where they are, and we have one threat to guard against. And we have, again, a relatively small landmass. It's a different story when you're dealing with the continent of North America, and dealing with multiple threats coming from all angles. So,
It's something I actually looked into. There's a whole bunch of complications, including the orbit of the Earth, including space. The reason why orbital, like satellite goes into is different from a top-down view of the line to intercept that actually does open up a whole bunch of other questions. Satellites circle the Earth, keep one in a location relative to Earth.
You wouldn't have one, you know, so you see the woman.
But that has also its other complications of installing ballistic weapons in space is something that people don't.
Supposedly, if there firmly was meant to be a loophole where they would have said, because gravity itself would give enough force, you wouldn't need any additional explosives on it. You could really just drop a metal rod.
That's good if you're trying to hit the ground. If you're trying to intercept a missile itself, that requires the degree of precision that we can.
You're legally allowed to have an engine in a metal rod in space. You just can't afford it. So if that would create the gravity calculations hits to the missile. The missile's going down.
but you're still weaponizing space. You're still launching a space-based weapons platform. And that was the rallying cry in Canada, was to keep space free of weapons. That was what got people out into the streets, and to prevent the use of nuclear weapons as interceptors. That's what the task of the Beaumont missiles was to intercept Russian sorties or Soviet sorties or incoming missiles with nuclear-tipped warheads. It makes it easier than, again, hitting a bullet with a bullet. Yeah, please.
What does NMD stand for?
National Missile Defense. National Missile Defense. And
What does SDI stand for?
Strategic Defense Initiative. Same idea, one coming from the Reagan administration, this one coming from the administration of George W. Bush. And again, our Prime Minister at the time, Paul Martin, was initially quite receptive, and then given this massive protest, changed his mind, which indicates to me that contestation is important in politics. There is no one best way. You don't know how things are going to turn out. There's this indeterminacy that's involved in these political decisions. Politics matters. Contra-functionalism, which says that there's a necessity to this, let the technocrats take over. I would argue that decisions matter, political decisions matter, sovereignty matters, different national interests matter, differing norms or principles or values, those matter too. And so we're left with this messy work of trying to achieve some sort of working consensus given this diversity of outlooks to begin with. And again, this will come up for Canada. Again, the authors of this particular new book argue that we're just drawn in this direction inexorably. I beg to differ, and I point to this particular example back from 2004 as an indication that that's not the case. Presently, too, just to add another wrinkle to this, the National Missile Defense System is designed like those theater defenses, like the Iron Dome in Israel, are designed to intercept ballistic missiles. You know, so if we're talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles or submarine launched ballistic missiles or intermediate range ballistic missiles, what characterizes them as ballistic missiles is their flight path. Ballistic missiles go up and they go down. You know, simple as this. And so based on the calculation of that trajectory, then you can start to decide how you can potentially intercept that missile. What we're dealing with now, what both the Russians and the Chinese have been testing and advertising their capacity for, are hypersonic cruise missiles. These would be missiles that would not follow a ballistic missile flight path. They could fly and change direction much as a jet would, though flying at hypersonic speeds. That would make it very difficult to even see that weapon coming. You know? And so another question then arises, if this is what we're trying to confront now, and you know, defense policy makers are really concerned about this presently in Canada and the United States, these hypersonic weapons. Perhaps a political question arises, well, if you can't target the arrow, perhaps you can target the archer. That might be more realistic, to target the launch site rather than the incoming projectile. Yeah.
But aren't we then getting into the Cold War situation of just launch mode, and the moment one launch gets launched everything else from each other?
The mutually assured.
Solving the problem unless you somehow have the knowledge to preempt it.
See, that's where we lean heavily on these preemptive attacks, and that's where a kind of new phase of imperialism potentially develops. Right? And that was the logic that informed the invasion of Iraq. That drive to preemptive defense, the idea from the 2002 National Security Strategy that the best defense is a good offense, seems to incline in this imperial direction. And then would seem to produce new arms races then too. Would produce the possibility for the misreading of signals and unintended or unnecessary wars also. Especially given how quickly these weapons could be delivered, shortening the decision-making cycle. Decisions made very quickly tend to be rash. Diodotus says about Cleon, let's just take our time here and think this through. Well, you don't have time to think it through when a weapon is coming at you at hypersonic speeds. Maybe people will make mistakes, as people tend to do. This is part of the concern here. But again, that's a very real political question. That's not a technocratic solution. That's politics. That's a real decision. Do we try to field an effective defense against these incoming missiles, or do we target the source and offer the capacity for a massive retaliation against any attack that would deter that attack, knowing what the return address of those missiles would be? That's another approach. But these are very real questions. How do we defend ourselves against this new threat? All right. That was a little sidebar, but I was just really excited about this book that I just recently read. I can share little bits of it with you if you like. No, so the way you usually do that is you get endorsements, eh? So sometimes you'll pluck things from the reviewer and have to go and ask for their permission and for their name. But the process for academic publishing is what's called double-blind peer review. So the reviewer doesn't know the author and the author doesn't know the reviewer. So there can be no kind of personal affinities getting in the way.
So you don't know who wrote the book, a book showed up.
Yeah. Actually, I do know who wrote the book. I'm the second layer of review. The reviewers of the book didn't know. I was reviewing along with 3 other colleagues to see if they get federal funding to support the publication. So any book that's published in Canada, any academic book, goes through double-blind peer review with 2 reviewers to say, should we publish this book? And then it goes to SHRC or NSERC or whatever the council is, different ones for different disciplines. And then that group of 4 reviewers in this instance make the case whether it should be funded or not. That's kind of how it works here. So a lot of eyes on the page. And it's peer reviewed too, which is kind of neat. So your peers with these people, you know. Convince me. It's a perfect example of the Enlightenment project. All right, back to this question, why do empires tend to expand? Why do empires tend to expand? Unless they're checked by another empire or until they begin to contract for their own internal reasons. We could, you know, point to some source in human nature, perhaps. Perhaps it's in our nature to, bless you, want to acquire more power. Machiavelli, for example, suggests that it's perfectly natural for human beings to want to acquire things. Hobbes writes that human beings in general are driven by, quote, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. We're all little Napoleons, according to Hobbes and Machiavelli. And, you know, as we mentioned earlier, Morgenthau describes all states as being motivated by, quote, interest defined as power. All of those conceptions of realism rooted in human nature seem to describe a certain naturalness to imperial formations. Again, unless they're balanced by another power. The Athenian ambassadors give a defense of the expansion of their democratic empire along similar lines. They say, quote, we have done nothing extraordinary, nothing contrary to human nature in accepting an empire when it was offered to us, and then in refusing to give it up. 3 very powerful motives prevent us from doing so: fear, honor, and self-interest. This is the so-called, and I mentioned this before, Athenian thesis. The Athenian thesis that I think provides a pretty neat summary of why empires expand based upon these 3 underlying motives: fear, honor, and interest. These map out along, if you describe these domains. On the one hand, we have the security domain. On the other hand, we have an ideological or civilizational domain. And on the other hand, we have the economics of imperialism.
Sorry, could you just repeat those last 3?
Security,
Yes.
ideology, and economics. Yeah. Fear, security, honor, ideology, and interests, economic gain. These are the 3 elements of the Athenian thesis. Okay? And what I'd like to do in terms of the structure of what follows from here is to go through each of those in turn. To go through the security motives for the expansion of empire, the ideological motives, and then the economic motives. Okay? So let's start with security. The argument made here by the Athenians is that security in the imperial center requires continued expansion. There's no clear division between inside and outside in an empire. In a way, between inside and outside. And actually, coming back to this national missile defense system idea, in a way, this idea of fortress America, the idea that you could kind of wall off North America from the rest of the world, would represent a step back from imperialism, if it were possible. A kind of isolationism on part of the United States, it would make that more tenable as a position. The alternative, sailing warships through the strait between Taiwan and China, projecting force, inclines in this other direction, which is that we need to project force there so that we don't encounter threats at home. In many ways, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were attempts to do just that. The United States had experienced this very bitter moment in having violence done to them at home in a way that they'd never been accustomed to before. The comparison is made to Pearl Harbor, perhaps, but this was even closer to home, an attack in downtown New York. And so the effort at that point was to draw fire, effectively, to fight them on our terms somewhere else so that we don't have to fight them at home, referring to them as international terrorists and the regimes that support them, right? So-called rogue regime. So there are choices to be made here between an imperial and more isolationist approaches. But again, what's characteristic of empires is that it's hard to discern that boundary. How is it requisite for the United States and Canada to project force, shores of China in order to enjoy security at home? There's no clear division here between offense and defense. This is a signal imperial strategy. So, as part of the justification of the Sicilian expedition, the Athenian ambassador Euphemus states, and this is in Thucydides, Book 6, paragraph 83, he says, quote, "Now, as we have said, fear makes us hold our empire in Hellas, and fear makes us now come, with the help of our friends, to order safely matters in Sicily, and not to enslave any, but rather to prevent any from being enslaved." So they're coming as liberators, but not entirely unselfishly. They're there to provide for their own defense back at home. This is consistent through all of the various proponents of imperialism for Athens. The main proponent of Athens' imperial project, Alcibiades, states that, quote, "We cannot fix the exact point at which our empire shall stop. It will expand continuously. There is no natural limit to this." And what would you point to as a natural limit? He says we can't distinguish between even Greek speakers and barbarians, keeping in mind that for the Greeks, a barbarian, barbaros, is someone whose language you don't understand. Apparently, the language of the northern Germanic tribes, who were the barbarians to the Greeks, their language sounded like bar, 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 bar. You know when you listen to a foreign language and you just kind of get the sound of it like that? This is what it sounded like to the Greek ear. The barbarian is someone who you don't understand. Even that distinction doesn't mean anything to Alcibiades. There's no natural limit to the Athenian Empire. "We have reached a position in which we must not be content with retaining, but must scheme to extend it. For if we cease to rule others, we are in danger of being ruled ourselves." Again, there's this idea of a preemptive defense driving this, what is outwardly an offensive posture. This is part of the debate on whether Athens should go to war with Sicily, right? A country that it was, or an island that it was not at war with presently. Athens was enjoying a relatively peaceful moment during the Peloponnesian War at the time, and Alcibiades argues we need another war. That's what will provide dynamism for our people. That's what will get our people together towards this common cause, and that will dissuade other cities from rebelling against us by making this forceful demonstration to others. Empires cannot clearly distinguish between their own national security and their control over their hinterlands. And so this blurry boundary of empire, its anxiety-driven security dilemma, contributes to this tendency of empires to expand.
Anxiety what?
It's anxiety-driven.
Oh.
Yeah. Fear of violent death is really a fixture of modern states. That's the kind of political psychology that underlies the social contract tradition that we're familiar with. But there's something about this imperial compulsion that goes beyond that. It's not just a fear of your violent death or my violent death. It's a fear of the collapse of civilization as such. As if the empire weren't to exist, life would hardly be worth living. Probably.
Yeah, it's like it's a struggle for its own survival itself.
The survival of the empire, that's
Yeah.
civilization. And so if this collapses, all bets are off. Better to have the world burn. Yeah.
It's the same sort of, I tend to that.
Oh,
I have anxiety. I need to have to think about it.
fair enough.
Would you want to live in 5th century? I think I don't want to live in 5th century.
So empire survival is its civilization.
Well, the civilizational motive is important. Every empire tends to put its civilization forward as the model for the rest to emulate. So Pericles says that Athens is the school of Hellas. Athens will teach the Hellenic world, the Greek world, what literature is, what drama is, what philosophy is, what democracy is, most importantly, in the political spectrum. And so there is that kind of valuation, that idea that there is a noble purpose that informs this mission.
What was his name again?
Uh,
The one who said that?
Pericles.
Pericles.
Pericles. Remember the funeral oration after the plague there, this famous rousing speech. And what's interesting about that speech, if you look at the grammar of it, it's really unclear. I may have mentioned this already, that it's unclear whether Pericles is asking the Athenians to be lovers of Athens or to be lovers of the power of Athens. In terms of the grammar, it's not clear what he's asking people to love. And I think the idea that, you know, it's the power of Athens itself that's the motive here is fitting. And so this basis of political community is very different than one premised on the survival of the individual. Security in that, I think, very easily understandable way. What do we want from our state? Defend the borders against invaders, protect us from criminals within these borders, so that I can carry on doing my own business. This is a very different bond, a very different civilizational bond that sees the expansion of the empire as an expression of the superiority of that particular civilization and their legitimate right to rule over others. And this idea really, it runs through this Sicilian debate. Again, a debate over the expansion of the Athenian Empire during a time of relative peace. Again, rather curious that we have a democracy here gathering to say, why should we expand our empire, and giving reasons why. So what were the reasons why Athens should expand? Well, there were Athenian allies and colonists in Sicily, and they came requesting aid. Plutarch, in his Life of Alcibiades, Plutarch is kind of infamously not so rigorous in his scholarship. There's some apocryphal elements of the stories that he tells, but he tells really great stories. I recommend read Plutarch's Lives, read his Life of Alcibiades if you get a chance. He tells the story of this episode and says that when the Athenian colonists came to Athens saying, help us, invade Sicily and protect us from the Syracusans, they would entertain Athenian envoys at their homes, and they would entertain them with plates made of gold and other precious metals. And so they really impressed the Athenians. They were rich, but they were actually taking the same plates from house to house to house. The Athenians got the impression that these people in Sicily are living large. There's a lot of wealth there. It would be worthwhile invading and occupying that part of the world. So this is one reason why, to aid these Athenian allies and to enrich Athens as a consequence of this then too. At 687, this is Alcibiades arguing to the Athenian demos. He says, we, Athens, assert that we are rulers in Hellas in order not to be subjects, liberators in Sicily, that we may not be harmed by the Sicilians, that we are compelled to interfere in many things because we have many things to guard against. So there's some sense in which Alcibiades is saying we have to do this. We have no choice. Empires get on rails. We've made all these enemies. Now we need to keep them all in awe. And the way to do this is this magnificent show of force through the domination of a far-off island. This is described as a preemptive defense. This is book 6, paragraph 18. Alcibiades again. What plausible argument then can we give ourselves for hanging back, or what excuse to our allies over there for not helping them? We have a sworn alliance with them, after all, and should go to their aid without objecting that they have not aided us. That is not why we took them on as allies. We did not expect them to reciprocate by coming over here to help us, but we wanted them to give trouble to our enemies there, and so prevent them from attacking us here. We will fight them there, so we don't have to fight them here. These allies have been useful by drawing the fire of our enemies, and now we should come to their aid. This is how we and all other imperial powers have built up an empire, by readily responding to any request, Greek or barbarian, for our intervention. Again, there's no kind of natural boundary to this expansion. Greek or barbarian alike deserve our attention. I think it's remarkable too, and one of the great reasons why I think we should go back to the ancients is just how brutally honest they are. Alcibiades says, yes, we're an empire, and we need to keep going with this now. In much the same way that Cleon says, your empire is a tyranny, and so if you're going to maintain that empire, you need to use these brutal sort of means to that end. If we were all to sit tight or let racial discrimination dictate where we give support, Greek versus barbarian, we should add little to our empire and in fact run the risk of losing it altogether. Faced with a dominant power, people do not just defend themselves when attacked, but they take preemptive action to forestall the attack. And we cannot ration ourselves to some voluntary limit of empire. Given the position we have reached, we have no choice but to keep hold of our present subjects and lay designs on more, because there's a danger that if we do not rule others, others will rule us. So this now a hopefully kind of familiar argument that defense of Athens proper requires this continual expansion. There's also a dimension of how do you enlist the people's energies? What are you trying to get people behind here? What is the purpose of this? Considering the fact that you're asking people to make real sacrifices, to sail to a far off land and put themselves in danger and harm others along the way. Colonization would have been part of it, yeah. We saw this in Mytilene, even though they didn't kill all of the Mytileneans. They divided about a third of their properties to be allocated to Athenian colonists. So there's that prospect. Colonialism is part of this, certainly. But in terms of the security imperative, the idea is, again, fighting wars on your terms so that you don't have to fight them on the terms of others. But there's also, again, a kind of civilizational motive at play here. How do you get the people together? How do you enthuse them? What is it that makes the Athenians Athenians? There's something characteristically fluid about Athenian identity. In the opening lines of Plato's Republic, Plato goes down to the Piraeus, goes down to the port, and he witnesses a festival to the goddess Bendis, a Thracian moon goddess, and he says that, I really couldn't tell the native Athenian procession from the Thracian procession. There's this kind of pregnant mixing of peoples within Athens, and that's one of the sweet dimensions of living at the center of an empire, is this collection of all of these practices and perceptions in one place. Life at the metropole is different than life on the hinterlands. Life at the hinterlands is provincial, small. Affiliations are familial or extended family. From a small town, so you look out and if you say, well, who's your father? Everyone all of a sudden knows who you are at that point. Life is much more interesting in a port city, in an imperial city in this sense. Yeah, the center of an empire is an exciting place to be. And just the different ideas rolling around there, these different religions happening there. But at a point you have to ask, well, who are we then? What is it that's definitive about our identity if there's so much mixing going on here? You know, if you go further back to the Persian Wars and the effectiveness of Athens in defending the Hellenic cities against the invading Persian Empire, the one kind of signal feature that points us in this direction is the fact that the Athenians abandoned their city. They abandoned the stone walls of the city for their wooden walls of their ships. They took off in their ships. You know, they were strong as a naval power. They did not feel that they could defend the city against the invading Persian armed forces, land-based forces. And so they took to their ships and were effective at countering this invasion in that way. Who are we as a people if we've left our place? One of the sort of signal features of political identity is an association with a particular place. You know, yeah.
One thing that I remember reading up on is when in the early history of Rome, when it was first sacked by the Gauls, during early history, there was a whole debate over whether they should abandon the city of Rome. And there was this big, it's said in the history, it's framed as a big triumphal moment where a centurion says the words like, "Here we shall remain most excellent." And it's like they kind of rally around the idea that, no, we're going to stay together.
The Athenians don't, though. They abandon their place. They abandon their city. And that question will resonate through their history here. Again, what is it that makes Athenians Athenian then, if it's not their association with Athens proper, that particular place, that walled city? Who are they? Here's how Alcibiades answers that question, and at the same time advocates for a continual expansion of the Athenian Empire. He says, this is at Cylon 18. Remember, too, that if the city is at rest, its mechanism will cease, like anything else out of use, and everyone's skill will atrophy, whereas constant campaigning will add to our experience and train us to fight our cause with action rather than rhetoric. Very much contra Alcibiades' teacher, Socrates, one of the more notorious teacher-student relations within the history of Western political thought. Contra the idea that the purpose of human life, the fulsome realization of our leisure, is to be at rest. Both Plato and Aristotle argue that to be free is to be at rest, not to have to work, not to have to fight to defend yourself, but to be at leisure. That's what all human beings want, according to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Alcibiades says, no, we will atrophy. Our powers will be drained from us. We need to keep fighting. That's what holds us together. That's what gives us common purpose. Again, not an association with place, not sort of divine rest, but continual action and adventure. My conclusion is this. To my mind, a city which has never believed in quiet will very quickly go under if it makes the change to quiescence. And the greatest security in national life is when people deviate least from their traditional character and practice, whatever its faults. Now, what's especially curious about this is this traditional character and practice is continual action. That's what will animate the Athenians. That's what will hold them together. Embrace empire and the drive to unlimited power as Athens' common bond. And at the same time, to make a display intended to leave an impression of power that would dismay potential enemies and enthuse the Athenian demos. All right. Let's take a little break at this point then. Yeah. Are there any questions on that? And then we'll move on to the civilizational and economic drivers of imperial expansion after the break. There we go.